So let's see what options we have to turn this cube into, let's say, for example, a coffee mug. So with left click, I have my cube selected. Then I press Tab to go into object mode. I have currently everything selected. That's not really what I want. So I press A, the A key, to deselect everything. See, the A key is for select or deselect everything. It has a double function. And then either with the vertex, edge, or face selection, you can select a face. In my case, I'm actually rather like using the face selection for this task, because with the vertex selection I have to click 4 times, and with the face selection I only click once. Okay, so then I can press E to extrude, and extrude basically means if you move your mouse slightly up, that Blender will take that face, move it away from your object, and then skin in the missing faces that basically fill the space between the face that is selected and extruded out and the rest of my cube. And if I press escape, I don't really want to actually move my face. I just would like to extrude it out. So extrude out means it generates immediately the faces in between. You will also see that along those red lines, they are small black filled rectangles. And those rectangles are the icon to indicate you that there's a face. You see here is a rectangle as well. So all those are faces. And here, I can't really click it right now, I think. Yes, actually I can in shaded mode. Sorry, wireframe mode. There are faces as well. So just as a heads up, when you start learning Blender and you see those black rectangles on a line, by accident you have extruded something. Only because you see a line doesn't mean that there's no hidden face. Anyway, at this point, as I said, I extruded and pressed escape. I pressed escape because I would like that face to remain where it is, and then I press S for scale, and then slightly move it in, for example. And also a small tip for scaling: if I move my mouse very closely to the scaling center, it's getting very touchy because I don't have a lot of screen space for my mouse to move to adjust the scale factor. And if I move my mouse further away and then press S, I have a longer distance to go, because from where I start, it's basically no scale, to the center where it's basically scaled down to 0% or the size. So I have more steps I could use. So let's say I scale it roughly like this. Then I can press 1 to go into a side view, press the Z key to go into shaded view, and then I can press E again and, for example, move this one down, and I hold my control key, so I snap to my grid. And let's take a look. I exited the edit mode, went into object mode, and there we now have a very basic container. And as you can see, we actually built the thickness on our own instead of, for example, performing a shelling command. Now let's try to adjust this a little bit, because what I would like to do is have those vertical faces line up perfectly with my grid. Because down here, those two bottom faces, for example, they are lined up to the grid. So to do this, I could click those faces. So then rotating around very often helps you to visualize the volume you have selected. And then I could, for example, press S to scale and roughly move it so that my vertical edges or faces line up with the grid, but you notice that the top and bottom edge is being moved as well, because currently I'm scaling along the X, Y, and Z axis, and I would like to exclude the Z axis. And again, to do this, I can press Shift and Z. So now I can only scale along the Y and the X axis. And then I move it roughly to where it should be, somewhere there. And then press, for example, my left mouse button. Can zoom in a little bit, and that actually looks pretty good. Okay, so how do we now turn this rather boxy looking object into something that feels nice and soft inside your hand? And this is now where I'm going to introduce you to subdivision surface modeling, and it acts very similar to the way how NURB surfaces work. But before we do this, you might have noticed that actually all faces we're dealing here with have 4 points or 4 edges, and that's exactly the same way how, for example, NURB surfaces work, because a NURBS patch is a 4-sided surface. Now let's go over to here where my mouse cursor is. There's a small blue wrench icon, and that is the modifier tab. So if I click on it, you will have a small add modifier pull down menu, and then under generate, you can, for example, go to subdivision surfaces, and if you click it, you will notice now that your cube looks rounded. And as the name implies, subdivision surfaces, this command or this technology takes your surface and subdivides it. And in a second step, then also smooths it out. And if you go into edit mode, you will see that you actually still have your original boxy object, but this modifier interactively generates an organic and smooth surface for you. So let's take a look at what options that modifier tab gives us. Up here, you have options for visibility. The first one is only for rendering. The second one is only for viewing while modeling. Then you have an apply and a copy button. I would not click apply as long as you really want to bake this geometry, because if I now go into edit mode, you see that my original mesh is gone and it's now subdivided into your final resolution. Whenever something like this happens, simply press Ctrl Z as long as you're back to your original step, and you see now I have my modifier back, and there's also my original cube. Cut More Clark in simple is basically if this object is just straight subdivided but still remains linear, or is being subdivided and is being smoothed out. So you want to use Cut More Clark. And then subdivisions, that is basically where you can set the levels. You see with each additional level the resolution gets finer, and 6 is the max, but most times kind of like 3 or 4 is a good level to work with. You don't need to make it too dense. And then render, if you click on this one, you don't really see anything, and that is simply the resolution that's being used for rendering, and view is the resolution that is being used for modeling. Let's say you have a very complex object and your screen refresh is going to be slow, then for example you can set this one to 1, set this one, let's say 6 or 5, and then when you hit render, your rendered image will show a perfect smooth out object. While working in Blender, you have a very simple representation. Okay, so that is basically how the subdivision surface modifier works. And if I go into shaded mode, wireframe mode, you see that with each view level, the wireframe gets denser, and this might be kind of like difficult to see and then model with it. So there is an option, for example, optimal display. And if I click it, then the view is basically simplified, which is very helpful because now I can play with my settings and it all remains the same. To make this object look a little bit softer, I would like to hide the facets a little bit more. You could press the T key or press on that small plus icon in the upper left corner, and then you open the toolbox bar. And inside Object Tools, I'm inside Object Mode. You will see between Edit and Object Mode, the commands change. I go to Shading and Smooth. You see, I have my cup selected. Click Smooth. And then you will see that the facets are gone and everything looks nice and polished. This command does not do anything actually to the geometry, it just shades it differently. So when I click on flat, I have my original faceted look back, and if I go into a top view, maybe let's go to here and click on smooth again, you can still see specifically at the edge how you still have that faceted look. And that's not really a big problem at all, because this geometry, and it doesn't matter if, for example, we use this resolution or this resolution, even this or this, if we convert that for alias into a NURBS surface, the input geometry can be very coarse. However, the output geometry for a NURBS surface will always perfectly smooth. So because of that, there's no point in really working in a too high subdivision level, because it will only make your object more complex and memory demanding. And you could just simply work with something like 3 or 4 and then have shading smooth turned on. And then wherever you have some flat parts, simply visualize how perfectly smooth that surface will be. Okay, so that's the way how you can, for example, show this in a nicer and softer way. Let's continue working on this cup, and actually I would like to straighten out the bottom part of my cup, because as you can see, if we would put this one onto a tabletop, it would fall over because the bottom part is too round. So with my object selected, I go into edit mode. But before I continue modeling, I would like to show you that there is a way to select, for example, the back geometry of my object while being in shaded mode and selecting it through my object. Because currently, all I can select is only what's visible to me, and that is a protective modeling feature, so that if I only want to work on this surface and not by accident select stuff on this back surface, I can't select it. But in my case, I actually would like to be able to select through my object in shaded mode, so I don't have to switch all the time between wireframe and shaded mode. And to do this, you have to be in shaded mode, and then where my mouse is, there is a small icon, and this icon is turned on, and it limits your selection by what's visible. So if I turn this one off, now you can see that there are the faces of my back surface, and I can select those. And you can see everything that's in front is still marked with a bigger face icon, and everything that is behind my object or is the back face has a smaller face icon. So it's kind of like a visual indicator for what you're working on. Okay, so with that actually turned on, I can now, for example, select this lower face and press E. And you see the moment I press E, the whole geometry shape or the surface flow changes. And that is because I added a new geometry and made that area denser. You might remember at the beginning of the semester when I was talking about placing CVs of a curve closer together to pinch a curve. The same way actually it works with subdivision surfaces and polygon modeling. So the closer I bring polygon points together, the tighter a curve will get, and the further I position points away from each other, the smoother the transition between those points. So in my case, I'm going to undo everything because actually if I press E, I would like it to remain where that surface is created. And then I simply, after pressing escape, press S, and then, for example, scale it in a little bit. I can, for example, do the same here as well. Press E and then escape and S, move it in. So you can see that I have a nice, somewhat flat surface, nice rounded edges, and then it flows into the upper surface. Okay, let's take a look at what we can do with the top part. I don't really want to have to select all those top faces and then do the same there as well, because pressing E and then pressing S for escape, pressing S for scale, doesn't really give the same result, because as you can see, it results into something completely unusable for us, because I'm just scaling to the center of my cup. So extrude is not an option. I could extrude and, for example, maybe move it up. That could work, but then I make my cup taller than I really want, and that's also not really what I have an interest in. So what are the other options? Well, we can use the knife tool, and the knife basically means I'm going to cut through my clay model and create, where I cut, new cross sections. And to do this, we could go to the loop cut and slide. So loop cut, I can click it, and then you see when I move my mouse to a black line, you will see a magenta line. And this line is basically the subdivision or the loop cut. If I now with my left mouse button click it, you see I have positioned a new edge, and then I can press G and Z and, for example, move it up to there. Then let's do the same loop cut. I go to this edge, and now with my mouse simply move it up, click, and if I don't like the position, then I could still by hand adjust it and bring it to there. Okay, so you see this way I added extra geometry to my cup by slicing through my object, and this way, because I added more internal geometry, I started tightening the edges there. I could, for example, do the same in the lower part as well to maybe make this edge a little bit tighter. So let's do this, loop cut, I click on my outer edge and then I move it down, and you see the further I move it down, the tighter the edge gets. And let's say maybe somewhat there, so it's even. And here I do the same, 2 cubes for the grid size. Okay. And if we maybe zoom in a little bit, it's really nice and soft, so there are no tangencies issues. That's a perfect surface flow you can achieve with subdivision surfaces. If maybe I would like my top edge to be nice and sharply creased, of course not necessarily something we really want to do, but just for the sake of learning this tool. See, now if I click on this edge line here, I can click it and maybe move it over, and then this way start creasing basically my edge. And this loop cut command, you also can see the shortcut is Control R. I can press Control R and then add a loop cut wherever I want. I can also move my mouse wheel. This, for example, instead of one cut, adds multiple cuts. So, for example, I undid my 2 cuts, press Control R, press my or scroll my mouse wheel once, so I have 2 cuts, click, and now I have this space subdivided into 3 new spaces. And all those loop cuts are positioned nicely apart from each other. Now you see, for example, those 2 loop cuts, they're actually not really at the same height. So how could we adjust those? Well, a very easy way in this case, because this is a nice tubular object, I could, with pressing B in wireframe mode I'm in right now, also works in shaded mode if you have that view limit turned off. With press B, you see your cursor turns into kind of like a selection area tool, and then I can drag with left click over those edges and then it selects it. If I press B again and with middle mouse button press and hold and drag a selection, I remove parts of a selection. So this is kind of like similar to the way how for example left click and shift left click works to add and remove parts of my selection, and I can quickly simply drag over it with the middle mouse button and B. Or I could also, for example, press Alt or Option and then click on an edge, and then you see it selects the complete loop cut or the ring. And pressing Shift and Alt and clicking on this edge selects then the next ring and adds it to my selection. If I, for example, click here, you see that everywhere it adds then a logical loop cut that is physically present. Okay, so going back to those edges that I have selected, I can have bounding box center, for example, as my pivot point, and then I can press S for scale, press Z for the Z axis, and you might notice now when I move my mouse up and down, I can scale actually my objects away from each other or towards each other. And I would like to scale them to 0, so I press 0 and they're all scaled along the Z-axis along 0, and they are perfectly the same. For example, down here my loop cuts are a little bit off, so I press S, Z and 0 and they all lined up. I could, for example, this is maybe too flat, play a little bit with the CV layout and, for example, pushing it down makes it concave. If I move those points a little bit up, I can play with the rounding a little bit more. So maybe that as a coffee mug might be a nicer vessel to use. To finish this object, I would like to add some sort of handle to it. And to do this, in case my 3D cursor is somewhere else, I select my cup and then say Shift S, cursor to selected in object mode. And then while being in object mode, for example, I press Shift A, add another cube. I can go into wireframe mode. With this cube selected, I go into edit mode and then scale it down a little bit. And then, for example, either move the object or in edit mode, move my cube geometry, maybe to, let's say, somewhere there. Okay, so then maybe I move this one up a little bit because the cross section is a little bit more flat than rectangular. And then I select the 4 outer points like those. And for example, I can press E, click somewhere, and then press G, press R to rotate, and then again press E, press G, R for rotate. And you see that I extrude out this face, rotate it, and move it to the correct position where I would like it to be. Maybe like this. And then this, of course, right now looks very boxy. So I could go to the object modifiers, add modifier, add a subdivision surface modifier, set it to 3, and click smooth. And let's take a look what we have. That's a good start. But you see that this object actually arcs in a little bit. And that is simply because it is a solid object. So this area here, for example, is closed. I would like to open this one. So I can select this face and then I press X for delete and then say delete only the face. So don't delete edges or vertices, just the face. And that removes the face. And as you can see now, it just opened that object and my surface starts from those 4 edges. And I can leave it inserted into the object. For example, the fillet or the blend that is missing, I could build in Blender, but because our goal is later to work together with Alias, the fillet tool and all trim tools or those commands I will touch up in Alias and do not that in Blender. Then I could go ahead and maybe switch to vertex mode and maybe play a little bit more with the proportions. Maybe here I would like to have a small ball or so, or something thicker. So I extrude it out one more time and scale it. Maybe this one should go to somewhere here. So you see, you don't really have to be concerned about breaking fillets or blends because you're working with a surface that is fluid all the time, which is a really nice way of sculpting actually your organic object. And you can always go ahead and move those around and play with it. It doesn't break any fillets because there are no fillets. It's just one continuous solid surface. Okay, well, maybe we can leave it this way. Maybe rotate this a step, kind of like this. Okay, so there we have, for example, a handle one type. And in case I would like this handle to go into my body, well, I don't want to delete this one, so I press Shift D to duplicate. And then I press M for move. And then click on the second layer icon or press 2. And then I move my object to that second layer. You see there now I have a duplicate. And then here I can go into edit mode, maybe select all those points and then say delete vertices. And in this case, that's fine because I would like to remove this sphere shape I created. And then I select all my endpoints again with the B selection tool, press E, and then, for example, finish my object by modeling a surface that intersects with the basic cup surface. and then I finish up the sculpting a little bit. Yeah, like this maybe. This seems to be pretty good as well. Okay, not 100% because this is a little bit too wide. Yeah. Okay, so there we are. And maybe a small note about layers. This handle I could maybe put onto layer 3. Now I have only my cup on layer 1, and I could shift click on layer 2 or shift click on layer 3. And then you see this way I could flip maybe quickly between different variations of my design. That's, for example, one nice way of how to use layers, that you have maybe one object that remains the same all the time on one layer, and then on the different layers you have objects for which you have alternative designs.